If you were to fly into the Solidarity Chisingoleño airport today, you'd probably step off like a bright pink Wizz Air jet, maybe grab your luggage alongside a crowd of tourists, and head toward a really modern glass terminal.
Right. But if you had set foot on that exact same patch of asphalt 70 years ago, you definitely wouldn't be looking for a taxi.
No, absolutely not. You would have triggered a severe, highly restricted military response.
Oh, yeah. You would have been standing smack in the middle of a deeply classified Cold War installation surrounded by military personnel who would be very unhappy to see you.
Exactly. And, when we think about infrastructure, we usually think of it as static. You pour concrete, you build a structure, and that piece of land just sort of has its permanent identity.
It just is what it is.
Right. But today, we're tracing the life cycle of a single geographic point of village in Poland called Gleiweiss that completely defies that idea. We're doing a deep dive into a Wikipedia article that you, our listener, actually sent in about the Solidarity Chisingoleño Airport.
It's a genuinely fascinating case study. We aren't just looking at the history of a runway here. We're looking at a physical space that was, almost violently forced to evolve.
Because the geopolitical world around it completely flipped upside down.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to figure out how a patch of dirt goes from being a secretive, heavily armed military base to an international commercial gateway serving a catchment area of, 1.6 million everyday people?
About 1.6 million, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can talk about the holidaymakers flying out today, we have to look at why someone decided to pour a massive strip of concrete in the middle of a forest in the first place.
Right, and to understand that origin, you really have to put yourself in the mindset of the 1950s. The initial construction of this airfield took place between 1953 and 1956.
The absolute height of the Cold War.
Exactly. Everything being built by the state back then has a strategic, defensive, or offensive purpose. And the location they chose is incredibly specific.
And honestly, a little bizarre if you think about it from a modern traveler's perspective. The article notes it's located 5 kilometers east of the town of Golinyo. But crucially, it is 45 kilometers northeast of Sisson, which is the major city in the region.
Yeah, that extreme distance from the main population center, that wasn't an accident. It was actually a primary design feature.
Wait, really? They wanted it to be inconvenient?
For civilians, sure. In the 1950s, military planners operated on the doctrine of dispersal. You didn't want your critical military aviation assets sitting right next to a major urban center where they could be easily targeted or observed.
Oh, so you wanted them hidden away in rural areas, out of sight.
Precisely. So they clear this land in Gleiweiss and lay down a completely utilitarian, bare-bones facility. We're talking hangars, a basic air traffic control tower, and a runway measuring 1,800 meters long by 45 meters wide.
Just the essentials. And for over a decade, this is purely a military zone. But then the script flips. In 1967, the civilian airport operating in a place called Dobby actually relocates to this military site in Gleiweiss.
And they rebrand it as the Port Lotnicy Chisingoleño. They essentially handed the keys of a military fortress over to civilian administrators.
Right, which sounds great on paper, you get a free airport. But reading through this, it reminded me of, imagine someone buying a surplus, heavily armored military Jeep and trying to turn it into a comfortable suburban family minivan.
That is a very clunky visual.
Exactly. Like you can paint it a nice bright color and you can bolt a baby seat into the back, but the suspension is still going to break your back on the way to the grocery store. You're operating a machine that was fundamentally designed to have its doors blown off, not to drop kids off at soccer practice.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The underlying DNA of the facility was in direct conflict with its new day job. A military base is designed to keep people out.
Right.
But a civilian airport is designed to bring thousands of people in. And we see that conflict force an immediate physical change, because just a few years later, in 1976 and 1977, they have to launch a major construction project.
Yeah, the text says they build a new passenger terminal, which makes obvious sense. You need a place to sell tickets and, keep people out of the rain.
Naturally.
But they also have to extend that original runway from 1,800 meters to 2,500 meters. And I have to admit some confusion here. To the average person driving in a car, an 1,800-meter runway is well over a mile of straight, uninterrupted pavement.
It seems massive.
It seems completely massive. Why did they immediately need to add another 700 meters to it? Like just a few years after civilians took over.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to the unforgiving physics of flight. The runway they inherited was built for Cold War fighter jets.
Mm.
And a military jet has what we call an incredibly high thrust-to-weight ratio.
Meaning the engines are just overwhelmingly powerful compared to the actual weight of the aircraft.
Precisely. It's the equivalent of strapping a massive rocket engine to a very light sports car. A fighter jet does not need a long rollout to build up speed. It is designed to scramble, pitch up, and get airborne almost instantly.
Wow.
And when it lands, it has deployable drag parachutes and heavy-duty braking systems. So 1,800 meters was actually a luxury for those planes.
Okay, but a commercial passenger airliner in the 1970s is a completely different beast.
An airliner is practically a flying hotel. It's heavy. It's carrying dozens, sometimes hundreds of passengers, thousands of pounds of luggage, and literal tons of highly combustible commercial fuel.
Right, so because it's so heavy, it has a much lower thrust-to-weight ratio.
Exactly. It takes a much longer roll down the runway just to gather the momentum required to achieve lift.
So it needs more runway just to get off the ground?
It needs more runway to get off the ground, but even more critically, it needs exponentially more runway to stop. Commercial aviation operates on extremely strict safety margins.
Which makes sense.
Right. Imagine a fully loaded heavy passenger jet accelerating for takeoff. If the pilot experiences an engine failure at the very last possible second before leaving the ground, they have to slam on the brakes and abort the takeoff.
Oh, I see.
The airport must provide enough remaining runway for that massive, heavy aircraft to safely brake to a complete stop without sliding off the pavement into a field. An 1,800-meter military strip simply did not have the physical length to provide that safety margin for passenger jets.
So that 1976 extension to 2,500 meters was essentially a mandatory safety buffer. It was a Band-Aid. But even with that extension, having a long stretch of asphalt is really only solving one part of the problem. Extending a runway doesn't matter much if a commercial pilot can't safely navigate to it in bad weather, right?
That was the next major hurdle. You can stretch a runway all you want, but if you don't have the systemic infrastructure to support modern commercial flights, airlines simply won't route their multi-million-dollar jets to your facility.
And that reality triggers what looks like a frantic checklist of modernization in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Poland has entered a completely new era. The geopolitical map has shifted post-Cold War, and this airport has to aggressively get up to international code.
It was a total systemic overhaul.
Yeah, instead of just looking at the dates, if we look at the actual projects, it's wild. First, they tackle the ground surfaces. In 1998, they rebuild the runway and the main apron.
The apron being the critical parking area where the complex ballet of refueling, loading luggage, and boarding passengers actually happens.
Right. But then the following year, in 1999, they undertake this massive upgrade to the airport's core electricity supply. And that allows them to install entirely new runway and approach lighting.
Because, again, a 2,500-meter runway is completely useless in the winter when the sun sets at 4:00 p.m. if the pilots can't visually confirm the landing zone through the fog.
Exactly.
Upgrading the electrical grid wasn't just a maintenance task. It was a requirement to keep the airport open for business around the clock, regardless of the weather.
It's all about reliable capacity. And the capacity demands just keep compounding. In 2001, they open a brand new passenger terminal. Between 2004 and 2005, they construct a state-of-the-art air traffic control tower to handle the volume safely.
And wildly, that brand new 2001 terminal was already too small just a few years later.
I know. They have to kick off a major terminal expansion in 2005, finishing in April 2006.
The pace of construction really reflects a desperate scramble to keep up with a rapidly globalizing European travel market.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because in April 2006, the exact same month that massive terminal expansion concludes, the facility officially changes its name. It becomes the Port Lotniczy Szczecińsko-Goleniów in NSZZ Solidarność.
They name it in honor of the Solidarity trade union.
Right. Now, looking at this timeline, I have to question the delay here. Solidarity is one of the most iconic, pivotal movements in modern Polish history. It was instrumental in dismantling the communist regime in the 1980s.
Absolutely historic.
So why did it take until 2006 to name the airport after them? Why didn't they do that during the initial post-Soviet wave of the 1990s?
Well, the source material doesn't give us the internal political memos from the renaming committee or anything like that. But if you look at the physical reality on the ground, the timing is clearly no coincidence. It aligns perfectly with the completion of that massive years-long terminal expansion.
You're saying they waited until the building was actually worthy of the name.
Look at it from a symbolic perspective. Throughout the 1990s, the airport was still functionally a military ghost. It was operating out of older, retrofitted structures. It hadn't fully transformed yet.
It was still that armored jeep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by April 2006, after a decade of relentless construction, new aprons, a modern power grid, new lighting, a new ATC tower, and finally, a vastly expanded modern passenger terminal, it had completely shed its utilitarian past.
Okay, I see.
Naming it after Solidarity at that exact moment was a declaration. The airport could finally project a modern, proudly Polish identity onto the international stage without the baggage of its Cold War origins.
It was finally a modern European gateway, not just a repurposed military base. But, a shiny new terminal and a powerful name only matter if people actually show up. You can build the most advanced airport on Earth, but if the planes are flying empty, the infrastructure is a failure.
Infrastructure is only as valuable as the utility it provides to the public. And the true test of this airport's transformation is the passenger data.
And the passenger statistics we have for Schiss and Golenio tell a really volatile story about how people travel. I like to think of this data table as basically an EKG of global events.
A heartbeat of the region.
Exactly. Let's look at the broad strokes. The late 2000s show a solid baseline. In 2007, they handled nearly 250,000 passengers, 231,711 to be exact. But over the next decade, the growth is explosive.
It really takes off.
By 2012, traffic jumps 35.8% to over 356,000. By 2015, it surges another 44.2% past 412,000. And it hits its absolute peak in 2018, nearly tripling that original baseline to serve almost 600,000 passengers, 598,971 in a single year.
That sustained aggressive growth validates every single dollar they poured into those terminal expansions and runway extensions.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the 2020 pandemic cliff arrives.
Right.
Traffic just completely falls off a cliff, dropping by 67.9% down to roughly 184,000 passengers as global travel freezes.
The recovery, however, is equally aggressive. By 2022, there's a massive 130.9% bounce back, and by 2023, they are approaching 500,000 passengers again, hitting 477,494.
The demand clearly never died, it was just paused. But while reviewing these passenger numbers, I noticed a glaring anomaly in the data. We see passenger numbers skyrocketing towards 600,000. But look at the cargo statistics.
Yeah, the cargo numbers are fascinating.
In 2007, the airport processed over 12,235 tons of cargo. Yet by 2023, that number had completely collapsed to exactly 90 tons. How does an airport see its passenger traffic triple while its cargo traffic essentially evaporates?
It seems entirely contradictory until you look at how the aviation industry fractured into highly specialized business models over that exact 15-year period. The text strictly gives us the numbers, but this divergence highlights a massive shift in utility. The airport didn't fail at cargo. It deliberately pivoted away from it based on market forces.
It's like watching a successful local hardware store completely stop selling tools so they can focus entirely on interior design consulting. And somehow, their foot traffic triples.
That's a great way to think about it. Global logistics and freight shifted heavily toward massive centralized mega hubs or a transition to ground-based trucking networks. Regional airports realized they couldn't compete in the heavy freight game. Meanwhile, an entirely different economic engine was taking off.
The low-cost carriers.
Exactly. Airlines like Ryanair and Wizz Air.
And low-cost carriers operate on a completely different philosophy than traditional freight or legacy airlines.
Entirely different. A low-cost carrier makes its profit on volume and speed. They want an aircraft to land, deplane, refuel, board the next group, and be back in the air in 25 minutes.
Which is incredibly fast.
Right. And you cannot rapidly turn around a plane if you are also trying to load and unload massive pallets of industrial cargo. Cargo slows the system down. So Schiss and Golenio found his highly profitable niche. They stopped moving goods, and they focused relentlessly on moving people. They became a vital hub for regional commuting and affordable European tourism.
They leaned into what they did best, which brings up a very practical logistical issue. Those 500,000 passengers have to be coming from somewhere. And when they land, they face a massive geographic headache.
Yes. The infamous last mile problem.
Which in this case is a last 45 kilometers problem. Let's look at the airline roster today. You have a lot Polish airlines running domestic routes to Warsaw Chopin, but the heavy lifters are the low-cost carriers.
No, Ryanair and Wizz Air.
Yeah, Ryanair is flying people to Liverpool and London Stansted with seasonal routes to Dublin and Krakow. You've got Wizz Air operating flights to Oslo. And for you listening, a highly time-sensitive piece of news: Wizz Air is launching a brand new route to Bergen later this month, specifically on March 30, 2026.
Which is great news. The continued addition of new international routes indicates the airport's business model is exceptionally healthy.
It is. But it all comes back to that 45-kilometer distance between the runway in Gluyas and the actual city of Szczecin. If I am a traveler, 45 kilometers is an absurd commute for a regional airport. Like, the airport is connected by the S3 and A6 roads, and there are coaches available. But if I have to spend an hour on a bus or pay for a massive taxi fare just to get to the terminal, I might just drive to a completely different city to catch my flight.
The geographic isolation that the military prized in the 1950s became a massive economic liability for a commercial enterprise in the 21st century.
So, what does this all mean? Looking at the timeline of their growth, I would argue that those record passenger numbers we saw peaking in 2018 would have been impossible without a critical intervention that happened in July 2013.
You're pointing to the railway connection.
Yes. In July 2013, they completed a tiny 4-kilometer rail spur, just 4 kilometers of new track. But that spur connected the airport directly to the existing mainline railway running between Szczecin and Kuberseg.
A total game changer.
Suddenly, passengers had a direct high-speed rail link. Today, up to 8 trains run that route daily, cutting the transit time down to about 50 minutes directly into Szczecin main station.
What's fascinating here is the disproportionate impact of a relatively tiny infrastructure project. Think about it. They poured millions into extending a runway by 700 meters. They built sprawling new terminals. They erected a state-of-the-art air traffic control tower. But all of that massive investment was effectively bottlenecked by a 45-kilometer highway commute.
So the 4-kilometer train track was the keystone.
Exactly. Just 4,000 meters of rail unlocked the value of 50 years of aviation upgrades. It finally bridged the geographical moat that the Cold War military planners had deliberately dug.
It solved the original sin of the airport's location, and that really brings the story full circle. We've traced the evolution of a patch of land sitting at a 47-meter elevation in the village of Gluyas. It began its life as a hidden, secretive, heavily fortified runway built for military jets.
A literal Cold War fortress.
Right. And through decades of forced adaptation, lengthening runways for heavy airliners, installing modern electrical grids, building expansive terminals, and laying down a crucial rail link, it transformed into the Solidarity Szczecin-Golenio Airport. It went from a closed military compound to a thriving commercial hub connecting hundreds of thousands of people across Europe.
It is the ultimate testament to the adaptability of infrastructure.
So, to you, our listener, the next time you are dragging your suitcase across the tarmac of a regional airport, maybe walking out to board a low-cost flight for a weekend trip to London or Oslo, take a second to look at the ground beneath your feet. Consider the hidden, forgotten layers of history under that asphalt. You might just be standing on a Cold War military base that slowly learned how to become a minivan.
I think the most profound takeaway from this timeline is the historical irony of it all. Solidarity Szczecin-Golenio Airport was designed and poured during an era defined by fear. It was built to service aircraft whose sole mission was to fiercely control, monitor, and defend violently closed borders.
And now,
Today, its primary function is exactly the opposite, facilitating cheap, accessible, completely borderless travel across the European continent on airlines like Ryanair and Wizz Air. It is a brilliant irony that a piece of infrastructure built explicitly to enforce isolation is now an engine of total human connection.